Hello. Let's jump in. All right. If I ask you to picture where your morning milk, your cheese, or your yogurt comes from, your mind probably goes to where? Maybe a pasture, a family farm, cows grazing under an open sky. But right now, billions of dollars of venture capital are betting that you will never look at a pasture again. While the mainstream media has been obsessively covering the culture wars over things like lab-grown meat, which we've talked about on this podcast before, with governors standing in front of cameras banning cell-cultured steaks, a completely different food revolution quietly slipped through the back door. It didn't ask for permission and it didn't wait for a public debate. It is called precision fermentation, and it is the corporate alchemy of the 21st century. And we're going to talk about it right when we come back.
The curtains rise, the lights burn bright. You're blinded now, can't see the fight. Smoke and mirrors, they lead the way. Fooling hearts night after day. Welcome to the show, it's all pretend. The smiles, the lies, the perfect end.
Welcome to episode 74 of Breaking the System. This is the corporate alchemy of milk, in case you didn't know. So to understand what's happening, we have to look at the science, not because it's complicated, it is, but because the corporate lawyers are using the science as a legal shield. So they take the genetic code, the DNA blueprint for cow milk, proteins like whey, which is a bacteria, or casein, and they splice those instructions into a host organism, usually a gene-edited strain of like yeast, fungi, or bacteria. And this microscopic hybrid goes into massive industrial fermentation vats, fed sugar, often from corn or other sources, and kept at just the right temperature. And these microbes, they eat the sugar and produce the proteins, or the target proteins that we're looking for. So chemically, molecularly, biologically, these proteins are identical to those from a cow's udder. Quite interesting, right? And that's the key point. Because it's molecularly identical, it behaves like real dairy in baking, allergies, and even nutritional profiles. Industry insiders have bluntly called it the excrement of bioengineered microbes in trade publications, but on grocery shelves, it's marketed as animal-free dairy. And we'll get to that in a little bit, because this stuff is already on your shelves and you probably don't know it. And you've probably consumed it. Okay? They aren't primarily selling gallon jugs of this to us, the consumers. Here's what they're doing. They're selling white powder to big food conglomerates as cheap extenders and things like shredded cheese, protein powders, baked goods, ice cream, and those awesome, very healthy, good, ultra processed foods. Wink, wink, right? And so there's no cow, there's no pasture, just a patented proprietary industrial process. Okay. And when we sit back and we think about this isn't entirely new. Humans have used fermentation for thousands of years in things like bread and beer and cheese and yogurt. But precision fermentation uses genetic engineering to turn microbes into tiny little factories for specific molecules. It builds on decades of biotech. Recombinant insulin in the 1980s, we're talking about Chromocin, which is rennet for cheese, since like the 1990s. And so how does a novel bioengineered byproduct enter the U.S. food supply without the kind of rigorous pre-market testing that we might expect from like our FDA, right? Because the FDA, they really have our best interest at heart. They really think about what's good for us, don't they? Well, remember a while back we talked about GRAS, GRAS, okay? So we enter the GRAS framework, and remember that's generally recognized as safe for consumption. This regulatory relic dates to the Food Additives Amendment of the 1958, and Congress passed it amid public worries about chemicals in food after incidents in the 1950s. And the idea was practical. Companies shouldn't need full FDA approval for every tweak to standard ingredients in things like salt, vinegar, or spices that had long histories of safe uses, right? So when we talk about those specific things, there's a lot of different kinds of salt, and if they tweak the salt just a little bit, right, they shouldn't have to go back to the FDA to get approval for that, okay? So this is what they call like the proverbial back door that these companies are now using, okay? So over decades, lobbyists and evolving practices turned GRAS into what critics call a self-affirming fast track. A company can convene its own panel of experts, yes, its own panel of its own experts. Yeah. They can run private studies. They can declare its ingredient GRAS and notify the FDA. The FDA, often under-resourced, no way, right, may issue a no questions letter. Companies can even self-affirm without notifying. We've talked about this in the past when we talked about with the lab-grown meats. So precision fermentation dairy proteins like those from Perfect Day, New Culture, and others have issued this path gaining no questions letters or self-affirming status in the U.S. for things like whey and casein and even similar ingredients. And we contrast that with the European Union, which applies stricter novel food regulations, and as of now, few, if any, precision fermented dairy proteins are approved for general sale in the European Union. The U.S. FDA has been reviewing GRAS reforms, but many products are already in the pipeline or on the market in ingredients. And this is what I talked about a while ago. There's a lot of products that are already out there. There's a lot of ingredients already out there that you and I have already been consuming that fits right into this, that was never tested by the FDA. It's never been the stamp of approval from the government because, you know, like I said, the United States government has our best interest at heart. Like they would never do anything to harm us, right? And so when we give these companies like this the back door to just put whatever they want in our food, as long as it meets the definition, right? And remember, we've talked about this in a lot of our other podcast episodes. The definition of something is very, very important because what's happening is these big conglomerates, these big entities like Kraft and Nabisco and all these others, right? They're using the definition of what this meats, of what this non-dairy dairy stuff is, right? And that's the back door for them to throw it into our food. And we consume it and we don't even know, right? And so the real action here has shifted back to the states, okay? Let's talk about the battleground here. Traditional dairy regions see this as an existential threat to farmers and rural economies. If corporations can produce milk proteins in bioreactors using cheap feedstock, what happens to the margins of real dairy farms? That's huge. So by making all of this stuff in a lab somewhere, right? Even though it looks like cheese and smells like cheese and acts like cheese and tastes like cheese, is it really cheese? And what are we doing to all of the jobs along the way, right? What we needed those farmers for, we might not need them for now. And what we need those dairy cows for, we might not need them in the future. And the other thing we have to think about is, are there any repercussions from this? Is our body, even though it looks like cheese and acts like cheese and it meets all of their criteria, are we able to break it down exactly like those other ingredients? Right? And that's something that we have to look into. And are there any repercussions, any bad repercussions from consuming this lab-grown stuff long term, right? Because we're not looking at what happens in 5 years or 10 years. We're looking at what happens to the human body, to what's going on in our cells in 20 years and in 50 years and 100 years, right? And that's kind of scary, because in 100 years, we might not need cows. Cows might just be another animal, and all of our dairy and all of our meat just comes out of a lab somewhere, and it's made with chemicals and whatever else, right? And then so just like with AI, we sit back and we ask ourselves, what is real? Is that steak you're eating real? Is that piece of cheese you're eating real? Is it real? Is it made from real stuff from the sun and the earth and the water? And is it made, or is it made? Is it man-made, right? And so going back to the battleground, Mississippi passed House Bill 1153 effective July 1st of this year, banning the sale of cell-cultured and replicated dairy products positioned as substitutes for real milk. Other states like Idaho have pushed labeling laws, as in Senate Bill 1270, requiring clear, we got to call it lab-grown or cell-cultured disclosures, and restricting traditional dairy terms for these things like milk, cheese, or cream, right? So if it's lab-grown, we can't call it milk. We got to call it something else. If the cheese is made in a lab, we can't call it cheese. If the cream is made in a lab, we can't call it cream. Okay? If it doesn't come from the udders of a cow, we can't call it those things. And so this mirrors earlier fights over plant-based milks and MGOs, battles over nomenclature and transparency and economic impact. And I probably butchered that word in there, but who cares, right? Proponents argue precision fermentation reduces land use and reduces water and reduces emissions compared to traditional dairy. It offers consistency and avoids animal agricultural challenges. Critics raise questions about long-term safety data, which, yeah, I have concerns about that. You should have concerns about that. Corporate concentration of patented tech, potential allergies, right? Since proteins are identical, right? Are we going to become allergic to this stuff? And that's a big one, because that's something I don't think we're thinking about, is if they take all of the natural dairy products away, okay, let's just hypothetically, and if everything is made in a lab by these microbes, right, and you and I or who else are allergic to said microbes, now we're basically allergic to anything and everything that's made from this stuff, okay? And so, therefore, the company would control what we can and cannot consume. And that's a big thing that we should look for, right? And I know there's going to be people out there that's going to be like, well, I'm already allergic to milk, so I can't consume it, so what's it matter? It matters in that if you no longer have a choice where your food comes from or how your food is prepared, like what's inside of it, okay, you no longer have a choice. You are no longer free to consume something else, because now that microbe or whatever maybe is in everything, because that is the long-term gain, right? And the other thing we have to look at is the disruption and the decentralizing of the American farm. Is this another end goal to destroy the American farm and the dream of being a farmer, right? We have like less than 1% of all Americans are farmers right now. Think about that. All of the food that we consume that's made in the United States, less than 1% of that, or no, sorry, that stuff is made by less than 1% of the total population. That's what farmers make up right now. And that's pretty scary. When you take out all of the individualization of a culture, and now it's all produced and given to the populace by a company, by a corporation, that's a huge red flag, or it should be a huge red flag. And that's the conversations that you and I should be having. Are we giving these companies, these corporations, too much power in what is being produced, how it's being produced, and how we're able to consume the consumables that's being made, right? That's some scary stuff. That stuff, we got to be talking about these topics. We got to be throwing these topics on the table and having these conversations. Okay? So dairy has always evolved with technology and with society. Early colonists brought cattle to America in the 1600s. And by the 19th century, urbanization drove commercial dairies, railroads, and pasteurization to combat disease risks in raw milk. Factory cheese making began in the 1850s. And the 20th century brought fortification and bulk tanks and homogenization and massive consolidation. We're looking at fewer farms producing more milk through breeding and through feed and through confinement systems, right? That's what we just talked about. Less than 1% of all Americans are farmers, right? That's pretty scary, because like 150 years ago, look at the numbers. Like almost everybody was a farmer. Almost everybody had cows and ducks and chickens, and we produced our, you just went out back and you milked your cow and you picked up your chicken, your eggs, and that was your breakfast. And mom or sister would go out and they would go to the garden and they would pick the carrots and the cucumbers and the tomatoes and the potatoes, and almost none of us do that anymore. How many of you out there right now, leave those comments in the, let's talk about this. Let's have this conversation. How many of you out there right now have some chickens and you go out and you collect the eggs and you have a fresh omelet in the morning? Like, that's as fresh as it gets. How many of you out there can say that you have a dairy cow that you can go in and you can squeeze the udders and put the milk in a pan and you have fresh milk? And you can make fresh butter from that, and you can make fresh cream from that. How many? How many of us out there have gardens that you can go out and you can pick a fresh tomato, or you can go out and you can pick a fresh potato and you can bake it, or you can make French fries out of it, or whatever, but it's fresh and it's not from a factory. It's not in a box or a bag or a piece of plastic. It's fresh from the ground. How many of us? Right? Not too many of us. Personally, I have a small garden. It's like 7 or 8 rows. I grow some beans, some potatoes, tomatoes. I have a couple stalks of corn. Hopefully they'll grow something this year. Never tried it before, grown corn this year. Got a couple strawberry plants, right? Just enough that like I can consume fresh vegetables in the summertime, and we get a little bit extra that we can. And we can eat off that in the wintertime, like some beans and potatoes and things like that, right? Let's have those conversations. How many of us out there have those things, okay? And so, jumping back into this, I get off on these wild tangents sometimes. My brain just all over the place, right? I bet I'm not the only one. And so precision fermentation, jumping back into this, precision fermentation is the latest chapter in industrializing food. From soil and animals to controlled microbial factories. Like recombinant rennet, which replaced animal-derived rennet in much of the cheese production, it promises things like efficiency, but shifts the control. We're completely taking the farmer out of the picture now, right? And it's made by a robot in a factory owned by one guy or a board of like 10 or 12, and that's where your food comes from. That's where your milk and your cheese and all that stuff's going to come from, okay? So let's extrapolate. Let's push out. Let's look at the big picture here. This is not just about milk. It's about a broader shift in our food systems from decentralized land-based production where farmers own the means, like the cows and the pasture and the knowledge, to concentrated intellectual property-driven systems where patents on genetic sequencing and bioreactors, they're going to dominate our food supply. Advocates highlight sustainability gains, reduced animal use, and feeding a growing population amid climate pressures. Ooh, climate pressure, right? Got to have that climate pressure, climate control, right? Skeptics warn of techno-feudalism, dependency on a few tech firms. That's pretty scary. We got to think about those things. Opaque supply chains and erosion of traditional agricultural and economic role. What's going to happen to all of us people? How is society going to change? And is that change going to be better for us tomorrow than how we currently have it? Let's think about that for just a second. Because both sides claim science and public good, and the system is changing who controls how we eat, and the trade-offs aren't simple. But if we take a step back, are we eating better today than we were 100 years ago. Think about that. You're right. We didn't have Oreos 100 years ago. We didn't have Twinkies. We didn't have Starbucks. We didn't have Ho-Hos, and we didn't have goldfish crackers. Think about all the things we did not have 100 years ago that we put on our plates, that we put in our cupboards, that we put in our fridge, that we put in our bellies. Are we eating better today than we were 100 years ago? Is society better today than what it was 100 years ago? And if not, why do we keep pushing society in the same direction? Right? If all of those things that are currently made in a factory by a robot, by a big conglomerate, if those things are not good for us, why are we pushing for more dependency on and from those systems and from those people? That is a big question, because we are and we do. Okay? And so the next time you pick up processed cheese or a protein bar or ice cream, you might want to check the ingredients, because these proteins may already be there quietly, because the alchemy is already happening. It's already on the shelves, right? I'm not for sure where. Like, we'd have to look more into this, okay? But I'm sure if we were to go to Walmart, Sam's, Kroger, IGA, County Market, wherever, and if we were to look in the cheese aisle and look in the dairy aisle, look in all of those things, we will find something that is not directly from a cow, that it came from this ultra-processed microbial whatchamacallit, okay? And so precision fermentation represents a profound evolution in food production. It's rooted in centuries of fermentation, know-how, and decades of biotech advances. It offers tools for efficiency and innovation, but it also challenges long-standing agricultural traditions, regulatory assumptions from 1958, and questions of transparency and economic power. History shows food systems constantly adapt to urbanization, safety needs, and, unfortunately, technology. The outcomes depend on how society navigates the tensions between progression and preservation. So here's our critical thinking question. We got two of them. As precision fermentation scales, right, as it scales up and we use it more, because we will, whether if we knowingly do it or not, because we probably didn't know we were already eating this stuff anyways, right? Should we decide what counts, who, because we won't get to decide this, right? Who should decide what counts as milk, cheese, or safe food? Is it the market, the innovators, the regulators, the farmers, or informed consumers through clear labeling? Remember that definition? This is it right now. What do we call milk? What do we decide what is labeled as a cheese? Okay? Because that's going to matter, and it does. Just like it matters, what is a woman? The definition of words matter, okay? And so the next question that we have to ask ourselves, what trade-offs in control, sustainability, and tradition are you, as the consumer, willing to accept? And why did you accept it? And so with that, this was Breaking the System. I hope you guys enjoyed tonight's episode. I hope you keep critically thinking about everything, the government, what you're consuming, how you're consuming. right? All of the systems that we play into every day, the market, the banks, money, all of it. We have to question things. We have to meet on common ground in the middle, and you and I have to stop fighting over little stuff because we're losing the battles, right? We're losing the battle on milk, on cheese, on meats. We're losing all of it. So with that, this is Breaking the System. We appreciate it. God bless. Good night. We'll see you guys next time. Peace.
Yeah. It don't rot overnight, you know. It fades.